Okay. So, welcome again to Politics and Prose Bookstore, where we now host in person as well as virtual events, partnered events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. If you would please silent your cell phones, that would be great so we don't disrupt the event. And while we've lifted the mask mandate, because we're so close to each other, we still encourage mask wearing. If you need one, we have plenty. We'd be happy to give you one. When we open the floor to questions, you'll notice a standing microphone here by this pillar. This is where we will take questions. We won't be able to address questions by raising your hand because we are recording for YouTube and we want to capture all of the questions that we can. Once the event is complete, if you would kindly fold up your chair so we can get the bookstore back to where it belongs with all the book stacks back together for our browsing guests, we would so greatly appreciate it. So now, without further ado, this evening I'm very excited to introduce Because Our Fathers Lied, and to welcome Craig McNamara and Jane Mayer to Politics and Prose. Craig McNamara came of age in the political tumult and upheaval of the late 60s. Come here. While McNamara would grow up to take part in anti-war demonstrations, his father, Robert McNamara, served as John F. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense and the architect of the Vietnam War. This searching and revealing memoir offers an intimate picture of one father and son at pivotal periods in American history. Because Our Fathers Lied is more than a family story. It is a story about America. Craig McNamara is an American businessman and farmer, serving as the president and owner of Sierra Orchards, a walnut farm. McNamara is also the founder and president of the Center for Land-Based Learning. He was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and is the only son of U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara lives in California with his wife and 3 children. McNamara will... And Julie. He will be in conversation today with Jane Mayer. Mayer is a staff writer for The New Yorker and the author of 3 best-selling and critically acclaimed narrative nonfiction books. She co-authored Landslide, The Unmaking of the President, 1984 to 1988, with Doyle McManus, and Strange Justice, The Selling of Clarence Thomas, with Jill Abramson, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her book, The Dark Side, The Inside Story of How the War on Terror Turned into a War on American Ideals, for which she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, was named one of the New York Times top 10 books of the year. For her reporting at The New Yorker, Mayer has been awarded the John Chancellor Award, the George Polk Award, the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, and the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence presented by the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Craig McNamara and Jane Mayer.
Thanks so much. I'm honored to be here and be able to do this interview. The book is really deeply felt. I thought incredibly moving, and it's not just a story about a father and son. It's really a deep reassessment of the personal price that sons growing up in Washington pay for their famous father's deeds, really, and in particular the Vietnam War. So it's really, I recommend the book to everybody. It's a wonderful read, and kind of a thrill to be here with you. Thanks so much. So you write in the book that for years, every time you said the word Vietnam, you came to tears. Why was that, And when did that begin?
Jane, I want to answer that question, but I just want to pause here for a second and thank you for being here, and thanking Politics and Prose for hosting us, and thanking you, friends and family and new friends. It means so much to me and to my family to be here. So thank you one and all. Now, on to the important things. I realized long ago that my entire life has been lived through the lens of the Vietnam War, one way or another. And the fact that my father is thought of as the architect of the war has been with me, and certainly has been with our nation since its inception, since he became Secretary of Defense and was sworn in 1961. And I realized that this war, the American war, the Vietnamese war, lives on with us. It has lived on in my life. And so the tragedy, the sheer numbers that we're all aware of the men and women who served from the United States in the war, 58,000 men and women were killed. I did some research that Ron Carver, who's taking that photograph right now, helped me find. I believe, Ron, and you can help me out, 2.7 million men and women from the United States served in the Vietnam conflict. At any one time, I believe there was 500,000. The amount of bombs that we dropped on Vietnam was 3 times the amount of World War II. And the napalm, and the tragedies, and the Agent Orange, that's why I wept.
And did you become aware of this as a child, or did you sort of venerate your dad when you were little and then become aware more and more that there was this tragic side to the war that he was leading? Or when did this dawn on you that this was not going well?
Yeah, thank you. I know the trajectory well. I was born in 1950, so I'm 72, and I followed the footsteps of a good friend of mine from Sidwell Friends. He left in 8th grade, and I went on to Sidwell in 9th grade, and when Frank Rue came back, I said, "Where'd you go?" He said, "Oh, I went to this great prep school called St. Paul's School." And so I followed suit. And it was there that Rick King, who's here with us tonight, who went on to be our class president at St. Paul's, had brought together a teach-in at St. Paul's. And I remember being in a glass phone booth, calling my father and asking him if he would please send me any leaflets or materials that he had that would show his support and why we were in Vietnam. I'm guessing that was 1966. I was 16 years old. To my best memory, those materials, leaflets, never arrived. And for me, that was the beginning of my opposition to the war. And it just continued through graduation and on into the late 60s and early 70s.
So did you begin to feel, it seems like you're describing it to some extent in the book, a sense of shame and guilt. Is that how it felt increasingly as you were moving on to college? And
I think the issue of shame and guilt and how one manages that in our lives is a constant struggle. And for me, as I enrolled in college in 1969, and I just checked the date today, I must have gotten my draft notice that fall. So that was my welcome to college. And I checked today, my number was, I believe, 90. I was born on April 18th, 1950, and I think my number was 90. So I was very draftable. I also had the ability, like maybe some of you, to get a student deferment for having been in college, for being in college. And I just did not think that that was fair, that men who did not have the opportunity or did not want to be in college, mostly many of them being black and brown, my black and brown brothers, did not have the opportunity to take a college deferment, and that it was my obligation to go to the Oakland Draft Board to have my physical. So that was a very difficult experience.
You describe in the book that you thought that you were willing to go through the experience, but then something happened, right? You were not eligible.
Correct. So let me just describe for you that experience, and maybe you all have experienced that. Walking up the steps of the Oakland Draft Board, taking the bus around San Jose and the Bay, and the resistors. There again, Ron published a book, Waging Peace in Vietnam, about the resistors who spent so much of their lives opposing the war. Were there to hand out leaflets and show alternatives to fighting in Vietnam. And then, I guess it's universal, the stripping of one's body, going through the induction, literally, and peeing in the cup, and all of the things that you go through. And the final person was the shrink, and the shrink looked just like me. He had long hair, he had a beard, and I said, this man will understand. And he understood and assigned me a 1A. So coming out of that draft induction, out of that physical, I was 1A. My mother and I both suffered from ulcers, and my wife Julie reminds me that ulcers are treatable today. In that time and era, we didn't know how best to treat them. And they were raging for both my mother and myself, and both of us had the same doctor at Johns Hopkins. And it was through that situation that I was classified as 4F. Unable to serve. And that's what I feel.
I mean, and in some ways, I guess you write that these ulcers that were, to some extent, caused to some extent from the stress that you'd internalized and your mother had internalized, maybe, from the kind of growing sort of feeling of tragedy in the family as the war grew and grew. If you went to go to the title of this book, I thought maybe it would be worth explaining it. It's from a wonderful and incredibly moving poem by Rudyard Kipling, and if you explain where you got the idea for the title, what it, and then, of course, what we want to know is what were your father's lies?
Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem, Epitaphs of the War, 1914 to 1918, and the story that I've learned is that his son wanted to enlist in World War I. However, he wore glasses, and he was not able to sign up. Rudyard went to the higher-ups on behalf of his son, and his son was able to enlist. There was a lie. The son, it's believed, in battle lost his glasses and was killed. And so, Because Our Fathers Lied is the poem that Rudyard, a long poem, a portion of which brings up Because Our Fathers Lied. If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. So a friend has asked me why the plural, and I think I've described why it's plural, because there are lies. And I think you've asked me, Jane, why I feel that my father lied.
And what his lies were, do you think?
I think my father, if I look at the trajectory of my life, and as a 16-year-old to 19-year-old, possibly in that era, it might not have been appropriate for a father to have told his son the truth about Vietnam. The truth that I've come to know, and during this process, I've established many new wonderful friendships. One of them is with Daniel Ellsberg. And it just turns out, there's a funny side to this. Daniel and his wife, Daniel just turned 92, and his memory is collectively bigger than ours right here in this room. And he and his wife live in Kensington, which is Berkeley. And this is a long way around the story. On the farm, our youngest family member, Emily, came back just at COVID, and her older brother said, well, Em, 1,000 day-old chicks are going to arrive in the mail tomorrow, and that's your job on the farm. So in the beginning of COVID, she's had to manage chickens for organic eggs. It just so turns out that Wednesdays are the delivery day, and her first market was Chez Panisse. So I love volunteering to be the delivery man, and there's a hidden agenda. I get to go see Daniel Ellsberg. It's a long way around. In these conversations with Daniel, he has really demonstrated to me the thinking of my father. And by the way, Robert S. McNamara commissioned the Pentagon Papers. Daniel was an author, not the only author. I think they may have met once or twice. But Daniel has showed me that my father's thinking was that this war was not winnable as early as maybe even before President Kennedy was killed, but certainly before 1965. So if you just think of our collective wisdom in this room, many of us are in my age group, we knew better. He knew better, and he was not telling the truth. It was not just to me, because that's insignificant. That's a father-son relationship. But he was not telling the truth to Congress. And the question is, why did he not tell us, American society, the truth? And I think about my father reading this book, and I think he would have to pause here for a minute. His stated reason was loyalty. Now, let me just read you a quote in Life magazine. My father was either fired or resigned in February of 1968. And remember Life magazine? It was large, 18 inches by 12 inches. There must have been a 20-page spread in Life magazine on May 10th, 1968 by Brock Brower. I don't know Brock. But this is a quote about 10 pages in. This is Robert McNamara. Quote, "Around Washington, there is this concept of the higher loyalty. I think it's heretical. I think it's a heretical concept, this idea that there's a duty to serve the nation above the duty to serve the president, and that you're justified in doing so. It will destroy democracy if followed. You have to subordinate a part of yourself, a part of your views."
Oh my gosh.
End quote.
Wow.
Now let me go on and say the oath that Cy Vance and Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, and the other cabinet members took in January of 1961 was, "I do solemnly swear and affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." He took an oath, like every cabinet member, to the Constitution, not to the President of the United States. So if you want to kind of excavate that more, his relationship with President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy and to the Robert Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy was a profound one. And to be the Secretary of Defense and receive the casket of President Kennedy and to decide with Mrs. Kennedy where the president would be laid to rest in Arlington, what a tragedy. And so I think the loyalty that he had to that presidency, and although LBJ and JFK were incredibly different personalities, his loyalty extended to LBJ.
Well, I'm so glad you got into this, because I think the code of loyalty that you describe is one of the things that's really fascinating in the book. I wondered, though, did that sense of, because just as the way you're describing it now, did the sense of loyalty prevent him from telling the president he served the truth about whether the war was winnable? Did he ever confront LBJ? Did he ever confront JFK if he knew as early as 1963? I wonder, do you have any idea whether he communicated to anybody his growing doubts, or maybe even to your mom? I wondered.
That's a wonderful thought at the end there. I don't know, and those are the things that we'll never know. And honestly, I don't think any historian will know. Phil Tubman and his brother Bill are writing a biography of my father now, and maybe they will be able to unearth that. Paul Hendrickson, a dear friend who's here tonight, did an amazing biography of Robert McNamara. I don't know if he can answer that question. Here's my guess. Here's Robert S. McNamara. And by the way, he had been appointed president of Ford Motor Company, and I think assumed that position for 4 to 6 months prior to becoming Secretary of Defense. Coming in as Secretary of Defense, the Bay of Pigs occurred in April. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred shortly thereafter. The Vietnam War was happening. He was managing the Defense Department, thousands of people, military generals, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those men, I believe, wanted war, and they wanted a bigger war, and they were willing to use nukes. So what do you do, Robert McNamara? You've got this powerhouse coming from defense. You've got a president. No president wants to lose a war. So what do you tell them? I imagine he told them at times it probably wasn't winnable. That's my guess.
And that same code of loyalty, I guess, comes up later in the book when you're at an event and he's asked sort of point blank whether he has any criticisms of the beginning of the war in Iraq. And he, I guess, for the same code kept him from wanting to criticize the people who came after him in office as well. Is that right?
Yes, I think maybe what we're talking about there is he was asked to return to Zellerbach Hall at UC Berkeley, his alma mater. And honestly, I don't know when the last time he had been on campus was. I would think decades. And Mark Danner, reporter for the New York Times, and Errol Morris, who did The Fog of War. And if you've had an opportunity to see The Fog of War, I think the history that McNamara speaks about that we've experienced is remarkable. If you haven't, I would encourage you to look at it. It's titrated from 22 hours of recording. So here they are, Mark Danner, Robert McNamara, and Errol Morris on stage at Zellerbach Hall. And Julie and I and our young family are there. We're seated in the front row, and I'm wondering, there's 2,800 people, many of whom are like me, protested the war vehemently. And is my father secure here? And what am I going to do if he's attacked? So that in itself was a moving moment. To get to your question, I can't answer that. Why did he choose loyalty over the truth? And why would you, if you knew the truth, isn't it our duty to act on that and in his case resign? And back to Daniel Ellsberg, he told me that Bobby Kennedy, young Bobby Jr., had overheard conversations of his father and my father, where Bobby, close to the campaign, was saying, "Bob, you've got to come out against this war. It's your obligation to do it." So there they are, two very, very close individuals, highly respect each other, and the truth doesn't come out.
Well, I just think that it's something that is so, it resonates even now. And as we saw in the Trump administration, Trump prized what he called loyalty above everything else. And he treated somebody like Colonel Vindman as basically the enemy. And Vindman felt he had to speak up for a higher truth, basically. So this is an issue that I imagine runs straight through American history, through every administration, but not always with the kinds of casualties that the Vietnam War was building up. And it's you know,
I'm looking for my book here because I want to.
Sure. You know, one of the things that is so difficult, it seems, in this book is your ability to both love your father, which he seems in many ways. Would you like my book?
No,
this
I
one?
had mine
Okay.
all set here.
Okay. Anyway, there's the tension between being a good son and confronting him. And I was left with the sense that you had regrets that you had never been able to fully confront him. You had opportunities and you tried on a number of occasions, but there were things you wished you'd said. What would you have said, and why do you feel like you couldn't quite confront him?
You know, there are regrets, and I don't live in the world of regrets, and I don't recommend that we do that. But I do. I just wish, whether it was close to his death and that he said that he felt that God had abandoned him, that even at that point, which was days before he died, that might have been a time to say, why? Why, you know, and my goal at that point was to ease his passing. Mm-hmm. But maybe I should have taken that opportunity. Maybe that would have freed him up in those final days. But let's go back to...
Do you think that's when he said God had abandoned him as he was dying, do you think he was thinking of this, the Vietnam War?
Without asking him, I don't know. He had a complicated life. but there were I guess I gave up long before that. And that's what I regret, is that taking that advantage, why not? There's an interesting story. Mother Jones came to the farm early on in the 80s, early when Julie and I had started the farm, and did an article. And, I was very naive. And we didn't, of course, have the internet. And I remember saying that, describing my relationship with my father, and that I didn't say that he didn't tell the truth, but I said that he would never talk to me about Vietnam. And I asked why he didn't do that. And the article went on. I'd never thought that my dad would read the article. How is he going to read Mother Jones? Well, a friend here in Washington, D.C. gave him Mother Jones, and a day or so later, Dad calls up and says, "Greggy, was that a real quote of yours?" And I said, "Yeah, Dad, that was a real quote." Didn't go anywhere. That would have been an opportune time to say, "And Dad, by the way, I feel more things about this situation with you." Every time I would fly from California to see my father in Washington, D.C., I'd get this call. Those would be early morning flights. I'd be driving to the airport about 4:30 in the morning. I'd get a call and say, "Hi, Greggy, how are you this morning?" "Well, I'm going to the airport to see you, Dad." "Oh, no need to come. There's just no need to come back here." And he loved me dearly, so it wasn't an issue of that, but I just don't think he wanted that, to create that space.
I have to agree from reading. I'm not your psychoanalyst, but this family is really an interesting family to read about, I have to say. So I do recommend that you read this book, because there's a very interesting dynamics. But it did strike me.
Father's Day is coming up.
It did strike me that he kept you at arm's length on a number of occasions when it would have been that opportunity, and that he may have been afraid of being confronted by you, because there was a moment in Telluride when he invited you to come to the premiere of the Errol Morris film, the tremendous, amazing documentary. And so you come along, and I'll have you tell the story, and then the same when you asked to go along on a trip to Hanoi, and he tells you he doesn't feel it would be appropriate.
Right.
He's pushing you away, and you're trying.
Right.
But tell what happens with Telluride.
Well, I think the two are stitched well together. And before Telluride, there was Cuba, and there was Hanoi. The Cuba, Dad went to speak with Fidel Castro and Khrushchev's son in Havana to study and unravel the near global disaster that the 13 days we were on the brink of. And it was a fascinating, I think, 2-day seminar. And I'd said, "Dad, I've all my life have been fascinated by Fidel Castro, because I grew up with the 13 days. It'd be an opportune time for me to go, to accompany you, to support you, and to learn." He said, No, I just don't think that'll be appropriate. So I've questioned, is that ego? What is that? And I don't have a strong answer, other than it may be the truth, because I would discover the truth along with him in those occasions. And the trip to Hanoi really hurt. I think that was 96, where he met with General Zapp. And General Zapp was, as you know, Ho Chi Minh's Minister of Defense. He led the war. And upon his death, I'm thinking 6 to 8 years ago, he was revered. Millions of Vietnamese came to honor him in Hanoi upon his death. And when Emily, our daughter, and I traveled to Vietnam in November 2017, we met General Zapp's son, Nam. And we met at the home of General Zapp. We met in the rose garden that General Zapp enjoyed. And the roses were still there. They were still climbing the trellises, and the trellises were made out of bomb casings that we had dropped on Hanoi. So the war, and that we need to pause here just a second. I was going to say the war lives on. The war does live on. And if you've traveled to Vietnam, you know that the Vietnamese are the most gracious, kind people. And I do want to read you a quote, once again, from Ron's book called Waging Peace in Vietnam. It's by a woman who is the director of the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, and her name is Tran Hoan Thao. And she says, quote, she's Vietnamese, obviously, "We don't forget the horrors of the war, but we forgive in order to move on. There is so much we can do together."
So they've forgiven.
Yeah.
Did you write this book, do you think, partly to try to see if you could forgive your dad or get forgiveness for yourself? What was the motivation, do you think?
Oh, thank you for that. You live this, all of us. Craig has lived a lot of this. And I just have to point to Greg for a second. Because as a senior in high school, remember being a senior in high school? Did you want to be there? No, you want to get the hell out of high school. And so Graham Wisner and I were able to write an independent study program. And I was connected up with Greg, who was either leading the Urban League in New York or very involved in it during the time of the Street Academy program. So I lived on Needle Park, and every day I would commute on the train down to 8th Street to work with kids from Harlem. So we go way back in that trajectory. And the question was?
Was this written in hopes of expiating the feeling that's hovered over you about the Vietnam War? Forgiving
Yes.
yourself, forgiving your dad, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is. Or at least taking an opportunity to really study it and take a deep dive into it. And Julie and I had an amazing opportunity in 2018. Stanford University has a program called the Distinguished Careers Institute based on a Harvard program that preceded it. And it's a year of studying at Stanford. And it's a true gift. You can study anything your heart desires. And I knew that was my opportunity to begin this process. And so I took a creative writing class, and I asked for an independent study person, was assigned an amazing Stegner lecturer. And she became my coach. And together, she first of all had me put out a piece of butcher paper on her kitchen counter and said, okay, where's this story going? Where's this memory? Just draw it, write it. What are the pieces of this story? And that was so helpful in beginning the process to answer the question. Is it guilt? Is it truths? Is it my journey with Rob here to South America to find my calling in agriculture? What is it? And how do you do it? And I thought, this is the Bob McNamara in me. Well, I'll get this done in 2 years, right? Easy peasy. Well, it's 4 years today. And what a journey it's been. Actually joyful.
That's not something every writer says, so if you enjoyed it, that's great. I wanted to talk a little bit about, get your views on growing up in this family. Are there any messages you think that you learned about how the U.S. conducts foreign policy, or anything from your father's, the way he was the architect of the war? I mean, he's known as someone who especially was taken by data, numbers, kind of a genius with numbers. But is the lesson that it was lacking in some way, the best and the brightest? I mean, I'm just curious, what did you take from what you saw of the way he handled the war that might be a message about U.S. foreign policy and defense policy?
What I was looking for here is, and I quote the lessons, the 11 lessons that in filming with Errol Morris that my father came up with, because I think they are, I'm not sure it's a gift, they are his study notes as to what we can do to try to change the path of war. And the first one, the first one is empathize with your enemy. Did he do that? Did we do that? We certainly did not. And that does dovetail into, okay, so you didn't do it then, and you realize now that it's a lesson. Do it. I mean, take the time and do it. And what could he have done? He could have apologized. Apologies are not enough. You asked about families. Apologies are not enough. The action behind apology is what changes things. So an apology, and then you say, what am I going to do, Robert McNamara, about the ordnance that still is exploding in the fields of Vietnam? What am I going to do for the GIs and veterans who've returned with significant bodily damages and mental damages due to the toxins that they administered and breathed while there? So empathize with your enemy. The third one I also think is quite ponderous. There's something beyond oneself. There's something beyond oneself. He goes into his usual maximize efficiency, propensreality should be a guideline in the war, get the data. Now he was a data man, but data in body counts, I mean, if that's what you're telling your infantry soldiers, to count dead bodies to win a war, you're gonna embellish that. And then he's telling that, and then he's getting data that's not fact-worthy. There's a couple more here. Be prepared to re-examine your reasoning. Oh boy, I mean, that's something that we should be doing every day, and policymakers need to be doing. Now here's one that I'm going to ask you, and we can talk about it later, what you think. I'm not sure I believe in that. Number 9, in order to do good, you may have to engage in evil.
That was interesting, that one. Yeah, so you feel that was his rationale for napalm and Agent Orange?
I guess. I mean, is that something that I want to live with? Number 10, never say never. Pretty good one. Number 11, you can't change human nature. Oh yeah, I guess that's true. You can't.
So those would be, you think there was wisdom in the end of his life that he saw, even if he didn't necessarily act on it?
I see those as wisdom. I see those as sharing his wisdom, and I see those, he was a strong anti-nuke man and a theorist and believer and writer on that. So I want to make sure that we recognize that.
So we're going to take questions soon, but I did want to also just ask about your mother, because it's a very moving portrait of your mom.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was interesting to me was that she went through her life being a fantastic tennis player and losing on purpose to your father, in order to solve, to make him feel good. I wondered, and at the very end of her life, she spoke to you, didn't she, about, why don't you say what it was that
So here she had lived this
forward.
amazing life, a true giver to everybody that she touched and touched her. And by the way, she was an amazing photographer, completely unorganized. So her slides were in a desk, every drawer filled with loose slides. And as she was coming to the end, and so she was my role model of this is how you live a life and you give of yourself. And she said, don't do as I have done. Don't give everything of your life. You need to hold something back. I thought, holy Jesus, Mom, you could have told me that a few years earlier, right? And I could have been practicing that. But what an amazing woman. And let me just tell you a fun little anecdote. Lydia Katzenbach, Nick and Lydia Katzenbach, and good friend John Katzenbach, who we went to Sidwell Friends with. Lydia and Mom, there was a scrambler in our hallway closet. It was a big machine, and supposedly it would scramble anything that my father was talking about on the phone, so that the Ruskies wouldn't interpret it and understand what it was saying. And my mom and Lydia had these long phone conversations, and occasionally they would hear like McNamara's band on the phone, and they would hear kind of like breathing and background music. They created this whole fantasy that that the CIA, FBI, whomever was listening to their stories, and then they would come up with these amazing whoppers that they would tell just to, so the person listening in would have a great fantasy. But what an amazing woman. I've loved her and miss her, and I think my father and my mother shared quite a bit.
Do you think that the losing tennis thing made me wonder if she held back telling him the truth of maybe what she thought about an unwinnable war?
Oh, that's very, very wise of you to bring that up. That's quite possible. I have a funny thought on that. Here we are, Mom's dead. You all are tennis players, right? And in the wintertime, you go out to those covered tennis places around here to play tennis. I'm not much of a tennis player. So I went out, probably could have beat him that day, let him win, following Mom's model. In the car, it's quiet. He's driving the Mustang home. He looks at me, he says, "Well, Craig, how are you and Julie doing?" I said, "Well, sometimes, Dad, we have problems." There was a pause. He said, "Your mother and I never had any problems." So, is that a old style marriage or what?
Well, I see people lining up, so maybe we should take a couple questions. My only advisory is make them questions, actual questions, not statements. So,
being a good journalist reporter.
Well, questions. Here's somebody right here.
Hi, my name is Samira Daniels. There's always context when you ask a question.
Can you speak up a little bit more?
Or maybe
well,
you can drop this down just...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. I said there's always context when you ask a question. I knew your dad, and I met him at a nuclear security conference, and he engaged me on the issue of the Iraq War. And I was really surprised, and maybe you can answer this. He would equivocate a lot. He would criticize Donald Rumsfeld's, the strategy, and yet I think he wanted to feel as if he had a better one in stock. And he remembered me because I wrote a letter to him when I was 16, when he was World Bank president, and he remembered my name. Wow. And that's how he started engaging me. And so I guess when you read the 11, where does his equivocation come from? Because it was at a nuclear security conference where we had even a longer exchange, and do you think that it was because of his advancing age that sometimes he'd get really angry quick, sort of fly off the handle? Do you think that those 11 lessons sort of fit, or do you think that he fulfills those lessons? I mean, do you think that there's a culmination of?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a very good one, and one that I will attempt to answer, but I don't know. The 11 lessons came about around 2002-ish.
Okay.
Oh no, actually, they came out of, in retrospect, his book. So they've been around for a long time,
read his book.
And they were highlighted and kind of grouped in the interview with Errol Morris. So he had plenty of time to think about those. You raised a very important point, however. Roughly when was that conversation that you had with him?
Well, I came to D.C.
But the last one that you had.
I'd say like a year or two before he passed away.
Yes. So I have heard that he was faltering.
Okay.
And was concerned about that. I remember a couple events that he was going to with co-authors, and he had shared with them that can you take the primary role here, and then at the last minute he would take it. So I think that.
Yes, he would.
But thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you.
My name's George Clodner. I actually had a question for both of you.
Oh, good. That's much better.
When during Vietnam, the way I looked for the truth was through what the journalists said, and Jane mentioned Best and Brightest, and certainly David Halberstam was a very outspoken critic of the war. And I remember when your dad's In Retrospect came out, and he did a book tour about the lessons he learned. Halberstam followed him around to every site,
Yeah.
and because he was enraged, and he said, he wanted to tell the truth at a different level than your dad was telling. I wondered if, number one, he must have been aware of what was happening. I wonder what his attitude was about this man who was following him.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in Jane Mayer's view of a reporter who was that focused on the truth that he would follow somebody around like that. If you've known of anything like that happened and how that strikes you.
Well, I think seems to me fair game. He's doing a public performance, and if there's a sense that he's whitewashing his history and not really coming to terms with it, I think as a reporter you'd want to hear what he's saying, and then if he's falling short, you'd be able to write about that. I mean, it seems to me it's not an invasion of his privacy. You don't want to harass somebody, but if he's doing public performances, I think it seems like fair journalism. So, Craig, over to you.
I would absolutely agree with that, and unfortunately, I don't have any background of that. It's a very interesting comment that you make. I believe it. I would love to have known more about those conversations, and I don't. Paul Hendrickson would probably have better answers to that question than I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for coming to Politics. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about, I know in your youth you spent some time in Chile, and this kind of coincides with your dad's time as president of the World Bank, and the decision was made to suspend loans to the Allende regime, and later to reinstate loans once that regime was overthrown. Did you guys ever clash about that, and do you ever kind of give his thoughts on whether that was the right decision at the time?
Thank you so much. That's a powerful question, and it's a question that was a timely time in our lives, his and mine, to engage in those discussions. I was then 22, and I want to share with you two experiences during that time. I was in Santiago, Chile, and I read in El Mercurio, the regional paper, that Robert S. McNamara, former Secretary of Defense, was going to be in Chile as World Bank president to attend the UNCTAD meeting, which is the United Nations meeting on trade. No idea. I was in a cafe probably 2 blocks away from him. Of course, there weren't cell phones. We were not in communication. So I was a strong believer in following the principles of Salvador Allende, who had been elected a year prior to that, freely elected as the first socialist president of Chile. And it was my understanding and certainly suspicion that the World Bank was aiding the fight against Allende by reducing loans and softening loans, and in that regard, helping the strikes against Allende. I did address it with him, but we never came to a clean slate on that. And I want to tell one funny story in counter to that. That same day, I was reading El Mercurio. There was an article that said, Robert S. McNamara, misspelled McNamara, picture of my father, similar to this picture, not a very becoming picture. Robert S. McNamara and his wife just purchased an island off the coast of Massachusetts, where he and his wife look forward to participating in nudism and developing new ideas of sterilization. So the backstory is that would have been in 1971-ish or 2, and my mom and dad were so fortunate to have purchased a part of Lucy Vincent Beach, which was the favorite nudist beach on the island. So they did buy that. And he was a zero population believer. So the idea of sterilization, a little far-fetched, but thank you for your question.
All right, thank you so much. You look just like your dad, by the way.
Thank you. I used to wear his glasses.
Hi, I wanted to ask if you were aware, and if you're not, what do you think now? Knowing that your family name is said in Vietnam today, in the rural north, by thousands of Vietnamese, because the Rover, Spot, and Fido of the rural north are Zone, Keat, Nick, and Muck. Those are dogs' names, derived from Johnson, Nixon, Kissinger, and McNamara. Are you amused that there's dogs all over the north called Muck, or are you offended, or is it just too weird?
You know, thank you for that. You're going to have to write that down for me. That's
Sure.
A new expression for me, and I'm fascinated by it. It reminds me a little bit when Emily and I did go to Vietnam. Chuck Searcy, who's been there since 1994 and has done an amazing job with Project Renew, he spent 4 days on the road together, and he wanted to show me a sign that in Vietnamese commemorated a disastrous technological decision that my father made. I believe, and maybe you can help me on it, it was a technological sensing system that would hopefully capture Viet Cong across the DMZ. And so these were dropped, I believe, by planes and in trees. It seemed to pick up a lot of water buffalo. It didn't really pick up a lot of traffic. And as we were driving along, very jungle area, I said, stop, I think I see it. And indeed, there it was. Back in the jungle a bit, we went with machetes and uncovered this stone that probably said very similar things.
You went to the War Remnants Museum in Saigon, and if you go to the right room there, there's a couple of those sensors.
Yes.
Which
yes.
are rubber
Yes.
rubber bamboo trees with an antenna
Yes.
and a penetrator in the bottom.
Yeah.
So they would go in there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that question. Hi, Ron.
Hi. So I was going to ask you something no one else is asking you about, which is how you chose to be an organic walnut farmer and why your walnuts taste so good. But and you're invited to answer that. But I also hope that you would say something about your decision to support this Project Renew to clear the landmines and what that means to you.
Thank you, Ron. And Ron is holding in his hand Waging Peace in Vietnam. Can I hold that for a second? Which is an amazing book that he and his wife and another person wrote. And Ron has put this exhibit on tour, so it started before COVID, I believe in Cornell, Columbia, around the nation, and came up through Southern California, and the last tour recently was at USF. And it's just an amazing compendium of the resistance movement that I've learned so much about. So thank you for that effort. The journey to organic walnut farming, we're coming up on our 42nd harvest, and I'm so excited to say that 2 of our 3 adult children have joined us permanently on the farm. And as first-generation farmers for Julie and me, that's a tremendous gift. I tell them, I didn't expect you to do that. And they said, you talked about it all the time, Dad, coming back to the farm. In any event, living with and working with subsistent farmers, I realized that food is intrinsically entwined in power and war, in scarcity, in injustice. And so after I had traveled from Palo Alto down to Tierra Fuego, lived on Easter Island, and came back to the United States, I was not yet ready to be home. I went back to Michoacan, Mexico, and spent another year working on an ejido. And it was that collective experience that really captured my desire to be a farmer. And I'm just honored to do that and continue to do that. And thank you for the comment about fresh walnuts. I want you all to eat walnuts, not just ours. But the reason they taste so good is the terroir, and that's the chemistry of the soil. And that's what Rob and I do, and Julie DeFord do, in terms of raising our crops in such a regenerative way. So we can talk about that later.
You were just asked a question about agriculture. What was your father's attitude about you becoming a farmer?
Well, this is David Wyman. David and I go way back because we fought the superconducting super collider, which was a physics project to unearth the black hole, and it would have taken 8,000 acres, including our farm, back in the late 1989-ish. the question is, what did my father think about my move into agriculture? He was then president of the World Bank. He retired in 1980, so my early years, the late 70s, he was still in the bank. On the macro level, he understood dams and electricity. He understood river blindness in Africa. He understood the big picture. He did not understand anything about agriculture. I remember as a kid with my two sisters growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the garden was the big place to go, and those tomatoes were just so beautiful, and he would have a salt shaker in the tomato and put the salt on and take a big bite. He loved food. He did not understand organic at all. He was a freeze-dried coffee drinker. So I think he did at that time back at Zellerbach Hall when he was on stage with Errol Morris and Mark Danner. That evening, Alice Waters was so kind to have a dinner, and she told me a story that when they met for the first time, he reached in his coat pocket and gave her a walnut, which is a very dear gesture. Thank you, David.
I promised a short question.
Last question, yeah.
Oh, no.
I'm sorry.
How has this experience affected your fatherhood in your role in being a dad?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think trying to listen and putting that first, and during those very difficult times of questioning my role as a father, what our three children are thinking and doing and needing, I do believe throughout my life, whether it's farming, politics, nonprofit board service, I've always tried to put family first. And that means listening and trying to work on our relationship, the married relationship. But the relationship with our children is so fundamental. And the pains that we experience are profound. And I just want to, I want to end on a bright note, but I also, before I end on a bright note, climate change has challenged our world to such an extent. As farmers, we feel it every day. The decisions that Julie and I and our children make today have 40-year lives. We're going to be planting organic walnuts, organic almonds. I look into our children's eyes today and I realize the anxiety and the stress that we've lived in for 42 years is now on their shoulders. And I'm hesitant to pass that legacy on to them.
Well, the time has come. Thank you both. Can we get a round of applause for our moderator and speaker? Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Craig. As a reminder to everybody, we have lots of